We're delighted to welcome you to the 14th Jaipur Literature Festival, protected by Dettol, straight from the front lawns of Diggi Palace. It's a pleasure to present today Indian cooking, the science, the art, the philosophy. Shylashri, Shankar and Krish Ashok in conversation with Ravindra Bhogal. Turmeric Nation is an ambitious and insightful project that delves deep into the socio-cultural elements that have come to inform and influence Indian cuisine. In this charming collection of essays, Shankar traces the countless patterns that form the Indian food palette, its preferences and traditions, offering a rich, layered and revealing portrait of India through its enduring relationship with food. Masala Lab by Krish Ashok is a science nerd's exploration of Indian cooking with the ultimate aim of making the reader a better cook and turning the kitchen into a joyful, creative playground for culinary experimentation. A session in conversation with celebrated chef and author Ravindra Bhogal to activate your palate and understanding with a focus on approaching India's culinary traditions through a scientific and historical approach. Shylashri Shankar, she is a senior fellow at the Center for Policy Research in New Delhi, is the author of Turmeric Nation, A Passage Through India's Taste. Her academic books include Scaling Justice, India's Supreme Court, Anti-Terror Laws and Social Rights, Battling Corruption, Has NREGA Reached India's Rural Poor, and A Secular Age Beyond the West. Krish Ashok. Krish is not a chef but cooks daily. He's not a scientist, but he can explain science with easy to understand clarity. He trained to be an electronic engineer but is now a software engineer. Born in Kenya to Indian parents, Ravindra Bhogal's food is inspired by her mixed heritage and the UK's diverse immigrant culture. Bhogal is a journalist, chef and restaurateur. Her debut restaurant, Jikoni, was ranked 56th in the UK by the National Restaurant Awards within 7 months of opening, and she has penned 2 books, Cook in Boots and Jikoni, proudly in authentic recipes from an immigrant kitchen. She also launched a home delivery brand, Comfort and Joy, a sister brand to Jikoni, in June this year. Please do remember to comment by typing into the comments section. Ladies and gentlemen, now presenting Indian cooking, the science, the art, the philosophy. Shylashri Shankar and Krish Ashok in conversation with Ravindra Bhogal. Enjoy the session.
Lovely to be here. Thank you so much for being here, Shylashri and Krish. Welcome and thank you to the Jaipur Literature Festival for hosting us. Wonderful to see you both. How are you faring in these strange times?
Doing well, right, actually.
Yeah, same here.
Well, congratulations on both your books. It's been really wonderful. I haven't seen the hard copies, but I'm sort of through the PDF. And Shylashri, I'm going to come first. Yours is just quite a tome. I mean, actually, one thing I want to ask both of you is, neither of you are chefs, but you've ended up writing cookery books. How has that come about? We'll come to you first, Shylashri.
Okay. Well, I love reading about food. You know, I love cookbooks. My bedtime reading sometimes used to be just recipes, books on etiquette. It's just great fun. And, I also grew up reading Enid Blyton's, with all the food and that. And in these lovely Time Life cookbooks, which when I was at university, we would just open one of the cookbooks and look at the picture, and then we'd go off and make it. We'd go and buy the ingredients and make the food. So it came out of there. And and I must give all credit to Prasanna Rajan of Open Magazine, because he asked me to write for the magazine. And I said, look, I'm a political scientist and I keep writing about the judiciary, and you've heard the introduction. So I wanted to write about something very different, and I said, do you mind if I write about food? So he said, fine, go ahead. So he took a gamble and I started writing, and I just sort of for the first time, actually, I let my mind wander. So I used my research expertise, but then what I did was I started with a question. And then I just wandered to all the different disciplines, and it didn't matter which discipline it was, archaeology, anthropology, science. And it was just wonderful to see the kinds of work that was done and the different answers that came out to these questions. So that's how it began. And then Neeta Kapoor of Siyahi got in touch with me saying, will you write a book based on these essays? And I said, sure. So it was completely accidental. So I'm a complete dilettante on this.
I mean, I think that's the thing about food. It is, especially for an academic like you, it is an education that is a lifelong education. the more questions you ask, the more you learn. It really is. And recipes are like stories almost with no endings. They keep going, you can keep adapting them. And especially from my perspective as an immigrant, you know, your recipes adapt as your landscape changes. So and over to you, Krish. So how does a software engineer write a cookbook?
So I've been cooking since I was when I was a teenager. So we were three boys, and my mother was also working. And she used to travel. So I said, as soon as she trusted that I would not blow up the kitchen, she taught me how to cook. So I've been cooking for almost 2.5 decades. I was living abroad, and so clearly that was when I used to try and collect recipes from older people in the family. And it's almost been a 2-decade-long obsession of mine that how our grandmothers cooked is by using heuristics, not by using recipes, by using generalized methods. And they kind of knew when something would work, when something would not work, how to fix stuff. And somehow I felt that and that to me was craft, that was engineering, that was science. And somehow we're not capturing sort of that wisdom. And so the software engineer me essentially said, look, we need to capture that tacit wisdom in the language of science. So beginner cooks now can not only understand, how to estimate, water for rice by using, the finger and the index finger joint method, but why? It's because of evaporation rates. So once you know the why, I think that knowledge becomes easier to transmit to people. And so it's my obsession with sort of, the whole computer science, the algorithm, making algorithms of, how you cook. So what you do is art, right? As crafting a recipe is art. But I think the actual act of chopping vegetables, getting it done, that's craft. And so I'm really keen on sort of documenting the craft of cooking, not so much the art of cooking.
And the science, it seems. And I find that really, really interesting because for me, particularly as a female chef, and the way I train my chefs in my kitchen, I've sort of gone very against the grain because kitchens tend to be very technical places. And the food that I cook at me has very much been about andaza, it's been about intuition, it's been about palate, understanding your own palate, trusting your palate, trusting your instinct, and all of that kind of magic that surrounds cookery. Because I always learn to cook for women. So I find it interesting that you found a place for science, particularly with Indian cookery, where recipes aren't written down. They're passed down the generations like gospel songs almost, like folklore. So was it that frustration that things weren't being recorded that made you want to sort of note things down and explain the science behind them?
Right. So it's actually fascinating that you sort of talk about the fact andaza, right? Counterintuitively, in my experience, I think andaza, as it's handed off sort of from mother to daughter, and so on, that's actually quite scientific because it's observational knowledge that has been tested over time. Right? Mm-hmm. On the other hand, an ultra precise recipe that you find on the internet has not necessarily been tested in the same way because it doesn't explain why you do what you do. And so I really think the andaza actually is a set of scientific heuristics in terms of how do you recognize when something is cooked? How do you recognize when something is too sour? How do you recognize when something needs balance? How do you infuse flavors into dishes? All of this is ultimately chemistry. And I think blending andaza and the science behind it, I think makes the andaza stronger. So I think, that's the way I think about this.
I mean, looking at your cookery book, and I find it really, really interesting. It feels very much like a textbook, which for someone like me who's used to sort of glossy cookbooks with beautiful photographs and everything, it feels slightly like, my goodness, this isn't exactly calling, it's not singing about the pleasures of the table.
Yeah. Yes.
I guess for someone who hasn't had that experience or that luck of inheriting, as we have, those recipes from our grandmothers and our aunts, it makes it very sort of approachable.
Yes, and in some sense, when we set out to write this book, I was targeting the popular science reader, not so much the person who's an expert at cooking, who's able to look and get inspired and sort of just naturally use all of the tacit wisdom they already have to craft something new. But in the middle of the pandemic, new people learning to cook, their foundation is that they're worried that they're going to add too much, water to rice, or that their chapatis are going to be too hard, or that their biryani is too soggy. And so in that sense, I think I also wanted to make sure that even if someone hates cooking, you can still, sort of understand a lot of high school science through the lens of what happens in the kitchen, right? The simple thermodynamics and the simple idea of how proteins cook or starches cook. And so I think that in that sense, I think I enjoyed it as a popular science, writing it as a popular science book as much as it is sort of like a basic manual for cooking in the Indian kitchen.
I'd be just another question on that. I'd be really interested to know. I mean, for me, my memories of cooking with my mother as a child, or my grandmother, they're quite romantic memories, of smells and sounds and stuff. I'd be really interested to get into your mind and what were your memories? What are those things that you remember from those early years in the kitchen?
So in my case, I think it's interesting because I grew up in a kitchen that was that cooked a very specific kind of food, mostly vegetarian, and it was only South Indian food, is what I grew up with. And in some sense, a lot of my culinary, the adventure, if you will, essentially started in high school as my friends sort of took me to Chandni Chowk and sort of said, you need to try this kebab, or when I went to the US and started eating Mexican food and and so on. So I think a lot of my shall we say discovery of other flavors happened much later in life, and the reason it's actually quite fascinating is that if you look at how the neurophysiology of flavor perception happens, what you experience in your childhood has a very, very strong and long-lasting effect on how you perceive flavor. So the reason why Michelin star dal is not as good as your mother's dal is not because your mother's dal is objectively better. It's because your nostalgia of it, your flavor memories, and it's the same part of the brain that processes memories and nostalgia that processes flavor perception. And we now only in the last few years do we know that. And so that nostalgia that comes across when you sort of experience a traditional recipe and so on is not something that happens, when you say eat a burger. It's something that you discovered later in life. And so it's actually quite fascinating for me. So, obviously I do have some comfort food in terms of, sambar and things that I have enjoyed, and dosas and other things that I've enjoyed as a child. But over time, I've sort of trained myself to say, you know what, I think there's an ocean, there's a universe of flavor that I have not experienced. I love the food in Mexico City or Bangkok as much as I love Indian food now. So, and I think, it's been an interesting journey that way.
And Shylashri, congratulations on your book. I've been really fascinated reading some of it. I mean, the subtitle of your book, Turmeric Nation, is A Passage Through India's Taste. I mean, for a country that is such a myriad of people, religions, languages, that's so diverse, how do you start writing a biographical account? That's what you said you set out to do, to write a biographical account of Indian food. How do you, I mean, that's such a daunting prospect. Where do you start?
Yeah, so I actually didn't start I didn't start with India. I started with me, and I thought I was very interesting, but then the publisher thought I wasn't. I mean, I sort of said I contain the multitudes, and he was like, I think you should just go beyond yourself. And so then I started looking at, and then I started trying to figure out what is Indian food, and and there was nothing. Each time you thought something was Indian, it turned out that some other people didn't have it. And so even turmeric, for instance, I mean, the reason I chose turmeric was because it was found in the cooking pots of the Harappans. And so I said, okay, that's at least something that we still have today, but it's also aspirational, even if people can't afford it, like the Dalits. There's a very sad essay in there about Dalit food, and even if they can't afford it, when the marriage broker comes and to the bride's family among Dalits, they ask, do they eat haldiya dal? Which sort of shows that if they have dal with haldi, which we think is normal for everybody, it's not. I mean, it's totally unaffordable for them, and so that's the reason I sort of chose Turmeric Nation. But then what I found was that the more I looked around at the research in different groups, and decided to treat it as a mosaic. So not India as like a homogeneous entity, but India as a mosaic. And what I did was I took different parts of the mosaic, and the mosaic keeps changing with season, with geography, with religion, with, caste. Even the same caste doesn't offer the same god, the same thing in two different regions. So, for instance, in Kerala, you'll find Brahmins will not offer, in the temple food, they will not offer anything salty. Whereas in Andhra Pradesh and Tamil Nadu, they do offer salty food. So salty food is considered impure in Kerala, but pure in sort of in the adjoining area. So when I found that, I decided that, these mosaics are a really interesting way of looking at it. And so I looked at mosaic bundles of these different groups, and they're constantly being transformed. So ultimately, to make a complete, very, very long explanation short, ultimately the picture of Indian food that actually emerges is that mosaics are being constantly transformed. It's one which is very plural, and it is also very hybrid. And what I found was pan-Indian. Instead of looking at India or Indian food or Indian cuisine as and looking for dishes, I thought it might be more interesting to actually look at what are the ways, what is it that we share in terms of how we engage with our food. And what I found was that there were three elements, which a number of scholars have also picked up on. And so I'm just going to tell you what these three are. So one is, and these three elements actually transcend region, religion, caste, and they define a pan-Indian attitude to food. So the first is our notion of equilibrium and balance. So the equilibrium and balance comes through the, both Ayurveda and the Unani, the Greco-Arabic sort of humoral theory, which is about balancing the doshas or the humors in the body. And most local cuisines actually, for most part, follow this principle. So, for instance, you will, even in the way in which your dishes are composed, you will have curd rice at the end to cool the system. You might have sambar in the beginning, rasam in the middle. So that's South Indian. And then, or you could have mango and then you would drink lassi afterwards. So it's that kind of a balance. And the second element is about how we understand flavor. So this is based on some research done by three IIT researchers who looked at about 2,500 recipes of tarla dalal's recipes from different parts of India. And what they found was that with Indian food, each spice has a unique function. So you won't have two spices performing with similar flavors in a recipe, right? So you won't have lemon and tamarind. You won't have dry mango powder and lemon and tamarind in the same recipe. So, and they call it negative pairing. And whereas in sort of in American food or West European food, you find positive pairing where you enhance the flavor by using two sort of ingredients with similar flavor compounds. So that's the second one. And then the third one, which I thought was really interesting, is about how our local cuisines actually engage with history and different layers of history. And, India's had a whole series of invaders and conquerors, but what's happened is that with each wave, the successors have adopted local cuisines. So there's been this hybridization of local with the conquering cuisine. So even with British cuisine, for instance, they come to India, and what do you find? You find that they adopt curry, and then and then you have khichdi becomes kedgeree, rasam becomes mulek soup. So you find this kind of hybridization going on in the way in which all of us in India, different cuisines, engage with history. So I thought these three elements were sort of pan-Indian. So instead of looking for dishes, I thought this might be one way of approaching it. But it's just my, it's just, it could be debated. So, and can I just quickly say, Krish, I read your book and I actually I reviewed it actually, and I thoroughly enjoyed it. And I actually did, I found it very useful because, because of COVID, I've had to cook. And And I must tell you, it is a nightmare to be sitting in the kitchen all the time when, it's not that much of a passion when you're forced to cook every single day with every single meal. And so your book was excellent, like for the chana and for the dal. But I do have a question for you, actually, because you talk about how recipes don't matter. You say in your book, recipes don't matter. You just need an algorithm. So I did that. I said, okay, so let me do this dal. And then for dal, you said, why don't you use tomato ketchup along with the tomatoes for the tarka, right? So I did that and I liked it, but my family didn't, because they said the dal tasted a little weird because it didn't taste like the dal that I always make.
No, I think it's good you say that, as I was telling Ravinder as well. Every person's taste perception is a function of their nostalgia, their memories. And the stronger it is, the more you will resist anything new. It's quite natural. One of the reasons, for example, and some of these flavor memories are so strong, and some of these molecules, we are so sensitive to them. So there's one sulfurous molecule on the surface of small fish. That's the quintessential smell of your fish market, right? We can detect it 1 in a quadrillion, sort of molecules. And it is so incredibly sensitive that unless you've been eating it as a child, and so your memory now essentially says, yeah, it smells funny, but it tastes delicious. So I'm willing to override the smell from the actual taste that I get inside, the umami and all the rest of that. Only then will you get used to the smell of fish. Otherwise, it's very, very difficult, which is why it's very hard for vegetarians to tolerate, for the smell of fish, or for South Indians to tolerate the smell of mustard oil, or for North Indians to tolerate the smell of coconut oil. And so I think, it's very interesting. And for most part, when I say, obviously there's a certain marketing nature to saying burn the recipe, right? I don't, so what I literally mean is, look, there is a time and place for documenting authentic recipes with their stories, with their history, with a lot of that richness and that magic as an art. Yes, absolutely, yes. But if you're looking to cook 2 times a day, and it's a chore, and you just need to feed your family, and you just need to do this efficiently, it's better you think in terms of algorithms, because that way you cook with what you have, as opposed to buy 20 special ingredients and spice powders and things like that. And things like the tomato ketchup is a concentrated sort of tomato paste with sugar, with salt, with vinegar. So it's a very balanced thing that really improves the flavor of anything, right? So in moderation, right, obviously.
But surely, I mean, even with an algorithm, that starts with the idea of a recipe. I mean, without
exactly.
You don't have something to sort of see you through.
Absolutely, it's art. It's art that gives the basis for craft, and then newer art is built on that edifice of craft, right? So a vocalist who does something magical in a musical sort of performance. There is art, there is magic. It's very inscrutable, it's surreal and sublime and so on. But it is built on 10,000 hours of rote, boring, repetitive voice training and practice, all of which is craft. And in some sense, what I say, I think the idea is to say that there are elements of cooking that you have to treat as a craft, that you literally have to treat as engineering. And you bring science to it, you do it more efficiently. You use the freezer more efficiently. You use modernist techniques more efficiently, so that you're able to sort of be more experimental.
Shylashri, your book really sheds light on the diversity of India and Indian food. I mean, you've lived abroad, you lived in America for 18 years. Were you frustrated living abroad at the kind of definition of what Indian food was abroad? And can you tell us a little about that?
Absolutely. Especially, I think, in New York, it was mainly sort of Bangladeshis a lot of Bangladeshis actually had the Indian restaurants, right? And so it was all very sweet. It was just a very weird, but there wasn't the kind of balance that you expected of the food, right? So you only got a particular kind of Indian food, which is the Mughlai food, which was full of cream and tomato, and the tomato made it sweet, I think. And then, they wouldn't put much chili in it because of American palates. So it was not, and then if you had to go to some really high-end restaurants, okay, there you would get more authentic food. But then I was a student and I was very poor, so, you couldn't afford those things. So you ended up making it at home. So, But yeah, I mean, that's something that actually I wanted to ask you about this, Ravindra, which is that, there is this whole notion that Indians have a high percentage of Indians are super tasters, or they have this sort of ability to have very strong sense. I mean, they can taste a very strong sense of flavor of a particular bitter compound. I think Krish can explain the science better. So, if they're super tasters, is that why it is much harder to do fusion food? Indian fusion food, because especially if you use try to enhance a particular kind of flavor. Is that why, in India, fusion food doesn't work as well as in the West? I was just curious whether in your kitchen you found that.
I mean, I can talk certainly about my experience of cross-cultural food, and we call our food mixed heritage rather than fusion. But for me, that thing of being a super taster or having a really enhanced palate, that comes from your sense of smell. And I think as a child, when you are surrounded in a kitchen, full of women throwing pods and seeds into oil, your nose is like attuned, almost like a bloodhound. You become really sensitive to flavors and smells. And so I think that's why we have such a keen taste of sense of taste. It's because our sense of smell is the thing that kicks in first. But I think that creating dishes that cross cultures has to be more about things that are just so far out, and let me put this ingredient with this ingredient. It has to be intelligently done, and there has to be a story, and there has to be some sort of commonality or something that brings those ingredients together. And for me, I've always been interested in story, and I do believe that when you bring cultures together through food, you're often creating something that's the better than the sum of its parts. And I think that's what I enjoy about that kind of cooking, where you're bringing cultures together. And I also think it's very natural when you're living away from home, away from India, and you're surrounded by mixed economies of so many other different immigrant communities. It's natural for that to start to feed the way you cook, because it's what's available to you.
Sorry, I was just going to say that, I'm with Ravindra on this. I think smell is everything. Smell is 80% of what you perceive as taste. But I'll go one step ahead and sort of, be slightly candid here. I don't think it's about more Indians being super tasters. I think the fact that we grow up in an environment where we're smelling 10,000 different things. And so our flavor memories are much stronger. And therefore, our nostalgia of a food is much stronger. And therefore, our tolerance for things that are not in our nostalgia is much lower. So I think Indian people have a far greater trouble building a taste for other kinds of food, simply because their taste memories and nostalgia are much stronger. It's one thing to be eating, like, sort of, say, a very bland hot dog, white cream pasta, mac and cheese, all your childhood. Then you discover newer cuisines. I think your memories are not as strong, so that you find it interesting. But I think we end up having way too much diversity and fantastic food when we're young, diverse food, right? And then so I think our tolerance for newer foods is a lot less. So the super taster thing actually comes from the density of taste buds that you have, and Professor Linda Bartoshuk so it comes from a sensitivity to one specific molecule that is very bitter. Those who perceive it as being bitter are said to be super tasters. So more so than, I've not seen studies about whether Indians on average are super tasters, but in general, women are more likely to be super tasters than.
They said a high percentage of Indians, actually.
Oh, is it? Oh, it's fascinating. Okay, yeah. Right. And mostly women, right?
They didn't say women, but they said a high percentage of super tasters. Yeah. But yes, we'll take them. Yeah, absolutely, women. I just add to that. So when you want to actually change tastes in India, or anywhere else, the questions you have to ask is, what does it taste like? What does it replace? And what does it remind you of? And so in India, for instance, you have The tomato comes in, and they sort of call it white aubergine because it looks like that. The coffee comes into South India, and because they can't get rice water because of the war, they have to switch to coffee, and coffee becomes a high caste Brahmin drink. Whereas in the North, you have tea, which becomes a universal drink. So it's also how you adopt those tastes that also makes a huge difference. But all of these things that we think have been very sort of ancient, because I thought coffee drinking was very, very ancient, and turned out early part of 20th century. And before that, it was considered to be this, this corrupting drink, where these, and there were all these letters written to Gandhi saying, these high caste Brahmin women have been drinking coffee and getting corrupted. They will not be looking for freedom, and you will have no non-cooperation movement over there. So, and then, and then it changes completely after 1920, after the war.
I'm interested in knowing your take on this sort of idea that, from your book as well, right? I think all Indian food is fusion food in some sense of the word. So there's one sort of annual ceremony that happens among some communities in South India, and so what happens is that it's a death sort of remembering your ancestors. It's one day when you do some sort of havan.
Right.
The food that is served on that day tastes nothing like the food that you cook on other days, because the ingredients used are only yams, banana, rice, ginger, turmeric, and black pepper. Now, clearly, these are all the ingredients that were available before Columbus reached America, got us, chilies, potatoes, tomatoes, and all those things that came later. And so, in some sense, Indian cuisine, right? So there's the cooking techniques that came from the Northwest with the invaders, cooking techniques that came, and appliances that came from the colonial powers, right? I mean, the British influenced our cooking as much as we influenced their cooking as well, right? So Anglo-Indian cooking is the use of vinegar and all those other things. So I think would it be fair to say that all Indian food is ultimately fusion food in some sense of the word?
No, well, then you sort of then the word fusion, because fusion has a particular definition in the food world, right? Where you're trying to sort of marry two different cuisines, but in very unusual ways. So you would have like a golgappa with vodka, which nobody would. I mean, it's like taking two very different things, but. So if you were to define fusion that way, then I wouldn't say all Indian food is fusion food, because in that sense, all food is fusion food, because it's all about interacting with history, with, people who've come in, immigrants, all of that stuff. So I would actually not use the word fusion for Indian food. Yeah.
It evolves over time. This is why recipes can still, there's stories that just keep changing with, the influx of new immigrants, invaders, whatever it might be. I just want to quickly ask you before we audience questions. I mean, you've clearly done a lot of research for both your books. What were some of your kind of favorite, almost enlightening research that came about through your research?
Do you want to go first, or?
Okay, all right. So I think in my case, clearly a lot of the simply the fact that a lot of your grandmother's rules of thumb were far more likely to be validated by science than by what you read in some more of the more newer books, I think is clearly one thing. But if you ask me for one sort of basic day-to-day cooking thing that continues to blow a lot of people's minds and people still fight with me about that, is the fact that marination does not get spice flavor inside the meat. It only gets it to the surface of the meat. It's brining that gets salt into the meat. And I think people still say, oh, no, there is a difference. If I marinate for 48, 72 hours, it is better. I said, ultimately all of that is that the acid denatures the meat outside and the spices stick to the surface. They do not penetrate inside the meat at all. Because if large, giant spice molecules could penetrate meat, we'd all be in trouble, right? So we are pretty opaque in that sense, right? So it's only a few things like water or salt that can penetrate. So I think, the fact that you don't have to marinate 72 hours is something that still continues to blow my mind and blow a lot of people's minds, because it's taken as wisdom that you have to do this. And so I think, that's one thing that I often that I discovered that was quite interesting.
We've actually got audience questions coming in now. So Jessica says that she believes food is a great source of stories and, of course, nostalgia. What are the memorable stories connected to food that you hold dear, or perhaps some of your favorite dishes, and what's the one that really reminds you of home? I'd be interested to know that too.
What's the one that reminds, oh, which dish? Okay.
Yeah.
It's very peculiar actually, because there's comfort food and then there is food that reminds one of home, right? So in comfort food, I would put spaghetti bolognese and dal and rice. And then in food that reminds me of home, I would actually put dosas, because I'm a South Indian. And so curd rice and dosas, which I used to hate growing up, by the way. So
I'm grateful. Us North Indians were savoring all that exotic stuff.
Yes.
Well, what about you, Krish?
So my favorite sort of food memory is clearly my maternal grandmother was a fantastic cook, and she's in the preface of my book is actually sort of there's an anecdote about her. Essentially, so she used to make this one special dish only for her grandchildren, clearly because it was a relatively high cost per unit dish because it involved all dals, right? So this is a dosa called adai, which is made from chana dal, tur dal. You can mix all dals, even soybeans, chana, everything. Any dal you can find, soak, coarsely grind with chilies, spices, asafoetida. And then you have to, on a cast iron pan, reasonably thick, but you have to cook it very, very slowly, right? And the best adais actually take almost 10 to 15 minutes per piece. And so it's a very, very painstaking thing to make, only made ultra crisp for, special grandchildren and so on. And so when I first went to get the recipe of this before I went abroad and said, you need to tell me how to make this, right? And I sort of troubled and said, how many, is it quarter teaspoon? Is it half teaspoon of asafoetida? How much salt should I add? And what ratio of chana dal and all of that sort of thing. She said, just try it out and see which one works for you. That's what she said. And the best part was what she said. Then she read what I wrote and she said, you're missing one ingredient. I said, ingredient is patience. Saying that if you just that alone will make an adai good. All the rest does not matter. For this dish, you need patience. So I think, so it was quite something that I still remember.
Elaine here wants to know what is your favorite Indian restaurant in the US, and preferably New York or Boston, she says.
Oh. Well, I lived in New York years ago, though. So when I was there, what's his, the chap who made Heat and Dust, James Ivory, Ismail Merchant, yeah. So he had a very nice restaurant called Bombay Club or Bombay something. I don't know whether it's still there.
Had a restaurant.
Sorry?
I never knew you had a restaurant. That's very interesting.
Yeah, on Fifth Avenue, actually near the plaza. So the food there was excellent. Very very small menu, but just about 10 dishes, but excellent food. So that was really, really good. Boston, I don't know. I'm sorry.
And Krish, any experience of
New York restaurants?
In New York or even anywhere else in the world? Have you ever come across a restaurant in another part of the world that you've just been blown away with?
My favorite food city is Mexico City, in that I don't care about restaurants. It's literally the street food. The smaller the taco stand, I mean, the flavors are just, insane. I think they use parts of the cuts of meat that would otherwise be discarded, and they make amazing food with it. The flavors, are just insane. I think they have 200 varieties of chilies and all that. But actually, in New York, I have a funny little sort of story. I don't know if this is still there. This is in Little India, the 26th and Lexington. There used to be a restaurant called Hotel Saravana Bhavan. I'm not kidding you, but this is not the Hotel Saravana Bhavan. It was a sort of a fake Hotel Saravana Bhavan, and they did not serve vegetarian food. They served Tamil non-veg, meat sort of food, and it was fantastic, right? I mean, we were sort of stuck between either getting shocked at somebody impersonating this restaurant and this famous restaurant and serving meat dishes, but the food was actually quite fantastic. But I don't know if it's still around. It's been a few years though.
Yeah,
I'm sure they filed a lawsuit.
I think over here in London, things have really moved along because people are traveling more, so they're more sort of likely to want to try things as they're served in India. But years before this, when I was making a TV show and I was sort of walking around looking at all these different restaurants, the ones that really stood out to me were the ones that were created by immigrants in the 1950s for immigrants. So, for example, the factory workers, a lot of them came without their wives. So they were cooking in these little restaurants, these little canteens, but they were cooking very much for other factory workers. And they've continued in that tradition of food, and those were delicious. I wanted
Actually,
to,
speaking of London, I do love Dishoom, fantastic Bombay street food in London,
yeah,
and
really well.
fantastic food, and also Koilon, slightly higher end, but fantastic food. Yeah.
What have been in all of your kind of travels and research in India, what have been the most unusual dishes that you've come across in your research?
Typically, a lot of the cuisines of the Northeast have been very interesting and fascinating and don't follow the usual template. There's a certain commonality of technique in the fact that you infuse spices into oil and then you sort of make a gravy, and then you add the other things and then you do a tadka, which is common across big chunks of the subcontinent. Only the proportions, the choice of fat, the choice of spices vary. Okay, and the choice of ingredients per se. But I think the Northeast has some really it is interesting, almost mix of more fermentation-based dishes, more soup-based dishes, and very non-intuitive flavor combinations that I find. I also love the sort of the Tibetan Sikkimis. That sort of I love that food as well. So that's some of the most interesting new sort of flavors that I've had, at least in India.
Yeah, I mean, I'm actually in that sense, my book doesn't deal very much with the Northeast. And I think that's an area, I think it'd be really great to actually have more of, and I think now we do have many more of those restaurants in Delhi than we did earlier. So, yeah, so I think that I think needs to be addressed. And in terms of unusual food, I'm actually I like mustard very much. So I actually love Bengali food which has the mustard sauce. So
Shukto and others, yeah.
Yeah, so I love that. Yeah, so it's more about the ingredients that people are using in the recipe rather than whatever the food is being cooked. So I actually like certain things very much. I love lemon. I love mustard. So anything that's sour, which is in my food, I would say it's wonderful. So, and I just to sort of very quickly say, in terms of what surprised me in terms of my own when I was doing my research was, I found that there was all this archaeological work where there's a lot of continuity between the Harappan and Vedic civilizations, and then in the genetic makeup of India. So they've come up with a lot of archaeological evidence about how there is a huge, we are more indigenous than we thought we were. And so the genetic makeup, if it goes all the way there, and it actually hasn't changed since 1100 BCE, can you imagine what it must be? How do our bodies actually process the foods is very dependent on how our ancestors did it. And so I actually conducted an experiment on myself, I had high blood, high cholesterol, and I decided to do it with the diet. And I did the diet, and so I followed the diet and the rhythm of the day, when I ate the food. I followed my grandparents' diet because that's what I knew. So, and it's amazing. Within 4 months, my cholesterol levels had come down from very high to borderline high. So just on myself. So now I don't vouch for it for anyone else, but I think there's something to be said about what your bodies process. And instead of rushing off and doing all kinds of diets, which come from different parts of the world, it might be very much more, I think, useful if you wanted to diet, to actually look back at your own patterns of what kinds of foods you ate, because I ate only South Indian food. I ate at 12 o'clock and then at about 6:30, and I ate a very small meal at about 6:30. So lunch was the biggest meal. So you follow those kinds of rhythms and see whether that works. So that was very, very surprising to me, actually.
Just one other odd, since we're talking of odd sort of items. I did actually, I did have fried cricket in Mexico, and I think it was delicious with garlic and chilies, and it was just delicious. I mean, yes, it does take a certain bit of this thing to get past the fact that you're eating an insect, but once you get past that, it's actually delicious. And then after that, I have tried. I found out that fried winged termites, which you get during the rainy season, right? So those things that fly about, they are a delicacy in South Tamil Nadu. And they're again fried with ginger and garlic. And so in some sense, I think there is a sustainability of meat question that is coming up. And insects are clearly going to be a part of the solution. It'll be hard for people to kind of get used to it. But trust me, if you are experimental, they're delicious, absolutely delicious.
I think eating insects and particularly crickets in Mexico has often a lot to do with place and being on vacation too. I think that opens you up to I'm afraid that's all we have time for. I've really enjoyed my conversation with both of you, and I look forward to more books from both of you. Thank you so much to JLF and the Shylashri Festival for having us all, and
pleasure.
Safe and take
Thank
care.
you very much. Thank you, Ravinder.
Absolute pleasure.
Thank you, JLF.
Bye, Ravinder.
Bye.
Thank you.
Thank you, Shylashri, Shankar, Krish Ashok and Ravindra Bhogal for bringing alive the joys of cuisines through this delightful conversation. This was truly the yummiest session of the festival this year. I hope you all enjoyed the session. We also thank our celebration partner, Diageo. And thank you all for watching and being such a great audience. Please stay logged on to continue to watch with us the series of exciting sessions featuring a stellar list of speakers that have been specially curated for you. As you're aware, the cultural sector has been critically impacted by the pandemic, and while we have braced ourselves to embrace the new normal, we have struggled to ensure that we can continue to bring you a free flow of knowledge and ideas. We would love for you to support us at Teamwork Arts. Any contribution is welcome and would help spread knowledge and ideas seamlessly against all odds. Also, please tweet using hashtag Jaipur Literature Festival 2021 and @Jaipur Lit Fest. The festival is protected by Dettol. Hope to see you in the next session. Thank you.